All right. Natalie, this is it. We're gonna reveal what relative surplus value is all about.
I think I figured it out.
Okay, you already know. It's okay. But as you can see, we have the same line that we started chapter 10 with. Now, I think it's quite, again, this book is so beautiful because it's sort of so logical and everything kind of builds off each point. But obviously, if we just spent all those pages talking about how workers struggle to put a limit on the working day, how about we just then assume that now the working day is fixed? And, perhaps there was a law that actually forced that on society. So now we have to think about, okay, if the working day is fixed, how does the capitalist increase surplus value? And as you can see, he does this kind of extreme example where the necessary part of the day, A to B, is 10 hours out of the 12 hours. And basically the only way you can increase surplus value is by decreasing A to B. So that's what we're talking about basically through this next 4 chapters. Yeah, 4 chapters. And essentially a fall in this kind of, so decreasing A to B means decreasing the value of labor power, decreasing the time it takes for the worker to reproduce their value as a worker, which is sort of confusing. A lot of the examples previous, that was kind of like a 6-hour period. Here it's 10 hours. But in any way, I think this is the very straightforward definition of relative surplus value here. Is just increasing the productivity of labor, making labor more productive, and this has become a whole concept in economics, labor productivity, and it just means how much value does a labor produce per unit of time, right? So all the examples he gives are like, say a worker is able to produce 12 items in 12 hours. What if he could produce 24 items in 12 hours? That doubled the laborer's productivity, producing twice the amount in the same amount of time. But this is the key to me, is that, again, much of his discussion of absolute surplus value is really like, what if the capitalist finds the worker with their own sort of mode of production intact, and they try to exploit the worker without changing the mode of production? All they can do is extend the working day. But increasing the productivity of labor, raising labor productivity, is fundamentally about the mode of production, the labor process itself, and that must be revolutionized. And you'll hear this word throughout these chapters about revolutionizing the actual mode of production, the productive forces, whatever you want to call it. And this is kind of starting to get at something, actually, if you go deep into Marx, like the Communist Manifesto, like he actually isolates like capitalism specific for this kind of constant tendency to revolutionize the technological systems of production through like constant innovation. So again, it's quite striking that, we entered the hidden abode of production almost 200 pages ago, and we haven't quite got to what you could consider like part of what makes capitalism, which is this just relentless drive to technologically innovate and change and make more efficient and more productive the labor process. So one more point. I think this is very helpful. As I mentioned last week, finally he actually just comes out and defines these terms, which is nice. He doesn't do that as much as he probably should. So again, absolute surplus value produced by lengthening the working day. And so in contrast to this, I call the surplus value, which arises from the curtailment of the necessary labor time and from the corresponding alteration in the respective lengths of the 2 components of the working day, relative surplus value. Again, in order to make the value of labor power go down, the rise in the productivity of labor must seize upon those branches of industry whose products determine the value of labor power, and consequently either belong to the category of normal means of subsistence or are capable of replacing them. So Should have said this earlier, but what he's saying here is that by increasing the productivity of labor, you cheapen the things that it takes to reproduce the worker. You cheapen the basket, or didn't I call it a bundle of commodities that it takes to reproduce the worker. So if capitalism is driven to increase labor productivity, if they're increasing labor productivity in food production and energy production and clothing production, that's systematically cheapening all the things it takes to reproduce the worker, so you can lower the value of that bundle of commodities it takes to reproduce the labor power, right? And so that reduces A to B in that formula, and widens B to C, the surplus value. So this is what this is all about. Now, there's a little bit of a problem, though. Well, before I get to the problem, we should just note, and as a side note, that, like, again, I said this before, but now we're kind of getting into something that's like systematically part of capitalism, this kind of relentless focus on efficiency and trying to find the most efficient, time efficient modes of labor and production. And this is, I believe this book came out in the 19-teens, this version 1919, but it's kind of, Marx wrote this long before Taylor, but this book is often referred to as Taylorism, and this principle of scientific management, of kind of subjecting the worker to, they did these things called time motion studies, where they're literally kind of measuring every move of the worker to find the most efficient sort of labor process to kind of, they were looking at pig iron production and looking at how the worker kind of shoveled things and trying to figure out, like, what kind of tool, what kind of motion would make the worker be as time efficient as possible. Another thing which obviously these chapters we read really get into is that the more you subdivide the labor and make it more efficient, you sort of de-skill and make kind of, you make the worker do one thing, this sort of one-sided work, so that in many ways you make it so basic what the one worker's doing over and over again, that, as Taylor actually said, that the ideal would be you could train a gorilla to do this work. And it's about this separation between the mental labor and the manual labor, and making the manual labor so hyper efficient, so streamlined, so subdivided, that you could train really anyone to do this sort of repetitive functions that sort of linked up to other subdivided tasks in this division of labor. So this relentless focus on labor productivity, on time efficiency of production, is just part of how capitalism works, and that's what we're going to be looking at. And it hasn't gone away, right? So we know that Amazon does these kind of time motion studies of their own workers, and they've tried to set up these things where they can put a wristband on the workers to track their every move. They already track their every move in their trucks and in their delivery vans, where they're trying to surveil and measure the efficiency, the productivity of these workers. And so this kind of obsession with time management and efficiency of the workforce is something that is, again, quite apropos to our current capitalist society. And the other thing I wanted to point out, I don't know if any of you have seen this movie, it's called Office Space, but it's really a beautiful movie, and it illustrates a lot of capital's principles. And there's one scene where the worker is forced to come in on the weekend, and to me that's like absolute surplus value, extending the working day. But these people are called efficiency managers, and they come into the firm and they interview the workers to try to figure out what they do here, is how the guy says it. And what they're doing is trying to basically eliminate redundancies, streamline the labor force, fire people who aren't doing useful things. So what they're doing is fundamentally like restructuring the division of labor. And this was all the rage in the 1990s. I think this movie came out in 99. It was called downsizing. It was called lean production. It was called all these things, but essentially all corporations were doing this kind of relentless restructuring of the division of labor to make it more efficient, to make it more productive, to get more value out of less work in less time, right? And so this kind of approach to corporate management, again, is still with us. Okay, so I had mentioned a problem, right? The problem is when an individual capitalist cheapens shirts, for instance, by increasing the productivity of labor, they by no means necessarily aim to reduce the value of labor power. So this is something that I think took me several readings to kind of get my head around, which is that Marx is saying that the goal of relative surplus is to decrease the value of labor power, but that's not really the goal of an individual capitalist to kind of, particularly if they're producing food, they're not really, trying to like make it cheaper for another capitalist to exploit workers that eat that food, right? They're just trying to do whatever they want to do. So Marx here says basically that it is not our intention here to consider the way in which the immanent laws of capitalist production manifest themselves in the external movement of individual capitals, assert themselves as the coercive laws of competition, and therefore enter in the consciousness of the individual capitalist as the motives that drive him forward. This much is clear. A scientific analysis of competition is possible only if we can grasp the inner nature of capital, just as the apparent motion, this is him getting his scientist. The apparent motions of the heavenly bodies are intelligible only to someone who has acquainted themselves with their real motions, which are not perceptible to the senses. So he says, like, we shouldn't be even thinking about individuals, individual capitals. Like, this is dumb, people. We don't want to look at it this way. Nevertheless, for understanding of the production relative surplus value, and merely on the basis of the results already achieved, we may add the following remarks. So he says, I know you want to think about this in terms of individual capitalists, so now I'm going to explain to you why, from the perspective of individual capitalists, why it makes sense for them to basically improve labor productivity for their own production as an individual capitalist. But he's trying to just put a big flag here and say, what I'm really interested in is these larger laws of motion and not the individuals, right? So that's the caveat, and that's the problem he seeks to explain. So I think it's pretty straightforward. I try to avoid a lot of the math, but we can just go into back. Remember our $50 pair of shoes, okay? And you have basically a market where all the shoes are $50, right? So what you find is that if a firm can improve the labor productivity of producing shoes, like they invent a machine that makes it way more efficient, they can produce like 100 shoes in an hour, whereas before it was like only 70 shoes in an hour. Now they've improved the labor productivity. They've created this new efficient way of producing shoes. And let's say the value of those shoes individually with the new machine are $30, right? So what he says is that then this new efficient shoemaker can go into the market and actually sell the shoes above their individual value, but below their social value, which is what society has said is the socially necessary labor time to produce shoes is going to come to $50 or whatever I just said, like 70 shoes an hour or whatever it might be. What this means, though, is that because they're selling it for above the individual value, they can, they're selling it for above, they can pocket like a surplus profit, right, from that innovation that they get individually as a capitalist. And so therefore, Marx has said, like, this is why individual capitals will invest in labor productivity to try to come out with a more efficient way to produce something, undersell your competition, pocket a surplus profit. You can see this sort of logic happening here, and how this would create a drive for all capitals to kind of seek out these efficiencies, seek out these advantages in the market, and so forth. Now he tells you how to think about this in terms of the value of a single commodity, like a shoe, and this sort of $50, $30. But he also says you can think about it in terms of the working day. And you can say, like, if you have, and I don't want to get into all this because it's a lot of math and it's really makes my head hurt. So, but essentially he gives the example again of a working day of 12 hours where 10 hours is the necessary labor. He does a lot of math to try to take into account that the worker has to reproduce the constant capital and all this kind of stuff. But essentially what it comes out is that if they're producing more items per unit of time, they're reproducing their value of labor power in less time. So the increased labor productivity, this exceptionally productive labor, acts as intensified labor, labor that's producing more in the same amount of time. It creates equal periods of time, greater values than the average social labor of the same kind. I should have included what the hell that asterisk says. But our capitalist still continues to pay as before the variable capital of 5S as the daily value of labor power. Hence, instead of 10 hours, the worker now only needs, this is the key, right? With increased labor productivity, for this individual capitalist, you actually do literally lower the A to B portion of the day, right? Because the worker produces more productively, they reproduce their value in that period of A to B just faster, right? Instead of 10 hours, now it takes them 7 and a fifth hours, 7.2 hours, I guess. And so that, that's a huge elongation of the surplus value for that individual capitalist from, I guess, 2 hours to 4 and 4/5 hours, right? So again, for the individual capitalist, they are literally lowering the A to B themselves, as well as lowering the A to B for all the other capitalists, workers that might consume those shoes, right? Because now they have cheaper shoes, which actually we haven't quite gotten there, because as one capitalist cheapens shoes or finds a new, more efficient mode of production and revolutionizes that mode of production, the law of the determination of value by labor time makes itself felt to the individual capitalist who applies the new method of production by compelling them to sell their goods under their social value. This same law, acting as a coercive law of competition, forces competitors to adopt the new method. So what he's saying here is that actually, as the new shoe production method takes the world by storm, all the other capitalists are like, holy crap, we got to catch up with this new method, and we have to produce shoes at this new fast machine or this new fast method, and we have to sell our shoes for $30 as well. And therefore, eventually 30 becomes the new social value. So what's happening here is, through that process, is you start to see how at a social level, at a societal level, individual capitals, particularly the ones that are producing the things that reproduce labor power, will tend to cheapen the bundle of commodities that go into the reproduction of labor power. Now, this theory also would posit that capitalists will cheapen things that don't go into the value of labor power. They're just going to cheapen everything. And it just so happens that the more you cheapen the stuff that reproduces labor power, the more you can actually extend the surplus value on a like societal level. So this is kind of, for me, like the money quote. That this is sort of like at a social level, capital has an imminent drive and a constant tendency toward increasing the productivity of labor in order to cheapen commodities, and therefore by cheapening commodities to cheapen the worker, right? And to me, this is kind of very illustrative of how we all kind of lament that our capitalist world is like a bunch of cheap crap. And so like, and also like, it cheapens us as people. Like, we have to subsist off this cheap world of like questionably nutritious food, right? Like, it's so cheap and it allows us to reproduce ourselves as workers, but it's almost like cheapening our bodies and cheapening our lives to subsist off this ultra cheap food, right? And but this is kind of what is the worker that is able to subsist off the dollar menu, it enlarges, right, the surplus value that the capitalist can extract from the worker. And so it's actually in history quite interesting to think about how, and I think Marx might have mentioned it in a previous chapter, but in England at this time, there was a whole battle over something called the Corn Laws. And the Corn Laws were a bunch of protective measures that the landowner class had put into place to protect their prices for, by the way, corn in Marxist, it means wheat. So the wheat production. And so that was in the landlord class interest. They want high wheat prices, so they get high rents and they get high money. But the bourgeoisie, the industrial factory owning class, realized that the higher the wheat prices, the more they have to pay their workers. So they were very against these protective things. And they, you know what they called for? Free trade. Let's lower the tariffs, lower the barriers, let all cheap wheat come from anywhere we can find it, right? And they knew that if you cheapen the price of wheat, if you cheapen the food, you can you know, pay the workers less wages, and you can extend the surplus value you can extract. So this was a really, you know, it became, even if Marx says like the individual shirt producer doesn't mean to lower the value of labor power, I think we could say that the capitalist class, if we go back to chapter 10, where, you know, we have this kind of classes that are emerging, the capitalist class sort of recognizes that like it's in their interest to have cheap goods that go into the reproduction of the worker. And this kind of, I could go on and on about all this, but like you can think about how the Industrial Revolution and the kind of factories that Marx is analyzing were really not just about mass production, but about mass cheap production of clothes, of clothing. It's called textiles, right? And that mass cheap production of clothing actually was able for industrial producers to kind of cheapen clothing on a world scale. And not just clothing, but other kinds of like fabrics and woven things. And this allowed Britain to kind of, in their free trade reign, to sort of call for them to be able to export these cheap clothes all around the world. And in so doing, they destroyed indigenous like garment and textile manufacturing in like India and China, where they had done like really beautiful hand woven like textiles that were like leading the world in the textile industry. And this sort of cheap mass production kind of destroyed those manufacturing systems in India and China. And some have called it like the first large scale industrialization of a region in the kind of 1800s, where the Indian textile industry was just decimated by this cheap production. But like, then you ask, like, was the world better? I mean, you can make the case because more got access to sort of functional, cheap ass cotton clothing, but it destroyed this kind of beautiful handmade type of stuff in the way, right? Along the way, I should say. All right, so, and this is kind of key, and this really comes into the analysis in the next chapter. But of course, one might think like, wow, capitalists are so good at raising labor productivity, that might actually lead to workers having more time for themselves, right? But he says, indeed, therefore, in the treatise of economists of the stamp of McCulloch, your senior, and the like, we may read on one page that the worker owes a debt of gratitude to capital for developing their productivity, because the necessary labor time is thereby shortened. And on the next page, they must prove their gratitude by working in future for 15 hours instead of 10, right? The objective of the development of the productivity of labor within the context of capitalist production is the shortening of the part of the working day in which the worker must work for themselves, and lengthening thereby the other part of the day in which they are free to work for nothing for the capitalist. How far this result can be attained without cheapening commodities will appear from the following chapters, where we examine the particular methods of producing relative surplus value. So that's him at the end of chapter 12 saying, okay, we're kind of doing like what we did in chapter 10, kind of empirically illustrating what relative surplus value is and all the different methods, which again, like chapter 10 is like, there's one method, right? Lengthen the working day, gobble up those moments as the elements of profit. But now it's like all these different methods. So it's kind of, it really widens the scope. But this analysis too, I think, just to always bring up our little UAW, this is a current UAW meme that they made. And again, they are talking about how it takes less time to produce electric vehicles. There is less hours needed to produce these vehicles. So instead of just allowing these auto companies to kind of use that as a way to fire workers and kind of and make the profits for themselves. They're saying, what if this more efficient and automated labor process could lead to fewer hours of work for all the workers? Why don't we have a 32-hour work week? Why don't we use this labor productivity as a way to make life better for the bulk of society, as opposed to using it to sort of enrich the profits of a small minority of capitalists who are who own this labor process, right? So it's this kind of antagonism between capital's drive to improve labor productivity, but then appropriate all the benefits from it, right? They get all the benefits. The workers don't see any of the benefits. In fact, as this analysis shows, like, it doesn't prevent the capitalists from still making the workers work long hours, even with the improved labor productivity. And again, once we get into the question of machinery, this relationship between automation and free time, which just doesn't happen under capitalism, is more fleshed out. All right, so chapter 13, which I find like just really beautiful chapter about how really ultimately, like, the most important way to increase labor productivity is to harness workers as a cooperative and collective entity that collaborate in the production of things, whether it be commodities or just use values, right? And that capital really starts to develop labor's cooperation as a method of increasing relative surplus value. But as I like to tell you in excited fashion, like this time around, I read this line: capitalist production only really begins, as we have already seen, when each individual capital simultaneously employs a comparatively large number of workers, and when, as a result, the labor process is carried on an extensive scale and yields relatively large quantity of products. When I previously read that, I've kind of like been confused by this. Like, why actually is this the assumption? Why is this just sort of, yeah, we've already seen this? But I actually think I might have slightly figured it out. That, remember last week when I was saying, really, what's the point of chapter 11? Like all this mass and rate. And then you go back to chapter 11 though, and he actually makes this point that capital needs a certain like level of scale of investment to create the mass of surplus value needed to kind of reproduce the capitalists themselves. So he says the presupposition of this transformation is a certain minimum of money or exchange value in the hands of an individual possessor of money or commodities. He says to live only twice as well as the ordinary worker, as well as that turn half of the surplus value produced in the capitalist has to multiply the number of workers and the minimum capital advanced by 8. So what he says here actually is that capital has to kind of amass a certain minimum scale of production to make it make sense to reproduce themselves as capitalists. And if they want to live better than their workers, they need a higher scale of production to do that. And he says the possessor of money or commodities actually turns into a capitalist only where the minimum sum advanced for production greatly exceeds the known medieval maximum. He has all this interesting stuff, how labor guilds really like restricted the scale of production to try to keep it more in the workers' hands and the sort of small scale skills of the laborer. And so I think that's actually what he's talking about when he says, as we've already seen. He's trying to say, chapter 11, I laid out that, for capital to be capital, it needs a certain sort of minimum mass of capital to invest. And he kind of extends that idea to, it's going to be one capitalist employing a relatively large number of workers in one spot, right? And so this sense of like, there's a capitalist, there's a bunch of workers, and they're in a workshop and they're working together. I want to flag something that he mentions here. This is true both historically and conceptually. With regard to the mode of production itself, manufacture can hardly be distinguished in its earliest stages from the handicraft trades of the guilds, except by the greater number of workers simultaneously employed by the individual capital. It is merely an enlargement of the workshop of the master craftsmen of the guilds. Here he starts to introduce key phrases, which you should keep an eye on, which are, it's kind of small, sorry. He periodizes, if you will, historically, a kind of succession of technological complexity or technological development in the production process, where you have handicrafts are one stage, manufacture is the one we're really into in chapter 13 and 14. And then chapter 15 is all about what he calls large scale industry, which is like the development of machinery and automation and that kind of stuff. So to visualize this, handicrafts are often like what are often referred to as like cottage industries, where people produce by hand by themselves in these little small scale kind of ways. You know, they might be like, you know, they might like be these, I was in Belgium and I did this like museum about the lace production industry and how it would take like 14 years for these little children to like be apprentices in the lace production. They had to learn all these things for 14 years. And so like these very small scale trades, like these where people are doing little things by hand, and they're doing them like in their homes or in a very kind of small scale. That's kind of what he's referring to as the handicrafts. Manufacture is a stage where you start to assemble the workers into one kind of collective division of labor, where you are subdividing the work into more and more specialized tasks that each sort of feed into one another. And so, you know, again, these workshops that started to really, he says these start to really blow up in like the 1700s, the kind of age of Adam Smith. And it's, you know, no surprise that Adam Smith, like, he talks a lot about him in these sections, but he really celebrated the division of labor. He celebrated like a pin factory, like where they subdivide all these things and they're so efficient. There's no time wasted between each task. This is kind of like the image of the age of manufacture. And it's confusing because we just think today manufacturing is like the sector of the economy and it's manufacturing, but he's kind of using it as a historical period of this kind of period where ultimately the efficiencies or labor productivity being gotten out of the workers is just by subdividing the workers themselves into more efficient arrangements, as opposed to the phase of large scale industry where the efficiency has come through replacing the human beings themselves with more productive machines that can do it faster and longer and harder and whatever. And so the age of large scale industry just creates a whole new spectrum. And this is what we call the Industrial Revolution. It's a pretty big deal, where it enlarges labor productivity beyond the limits of human muscles and human labor power itself, right? Because as efficient as the age of manufacture is, as I'll get into in a second, it's really just about humans doing things in more efficient ways. But now we're production's starting to be done by machines, right? Okay.
Are there no machines in manufacturing, or are there just?
There are, but they're driven by human hands. Sometimes actually, if you get into this, they actually had like literal like horses driving like a thing around, like a crank around, or sometimes they would use water power in marginal ways, but most of the work being done was by humans, right? Human labor power. And again, when you read chapter 15, Marx starts to talk like what happens when work starts to get done by an automatic mechanism. That's like an autonomous, like this automatic thing. That's very different than when you have to have a hand doing something physically. No, please. Anyone can always stop to talk and ask questions. So in such cases, the effect of the combined labor could either not be produced all by isolated individual labor, or it could be produced only by great expenditure of time or on a dwarf-like scale. Not only do we have here an increase in the productive power of the individual by means of cooperation, but the creation of a new productive power, which is intrinsically a collective one. So what's really fascinating to me, and I'll get more into it, is Marx is kind of saying that like capital, through its drive for labor productivity, is actually harnessing a collective social power of workers. By subdividing them into a division of labor, you're creating a more intrinsically interrelated and interdependent labor process where each little worker is dependent on the other worker, right? And it's we think of capitalism all about private power and individualism and this and that, but he's trying to say that capital can kind of like harness this collective power of the division of labor of workers. And before I forget to say it, like, we really need to highlight that Marx is saying that, like, they pay their workers as individuals. Each worker only gets a wage as a private person in the market, and they get paid as individuals. But capital can like harness this extra value that a collective of workers can make, right? And they just get to appropriate that extra value for free, as I'll get into in a sec. This is like literally one of my favorite quotes in probably the whole book. But I think he says, let me see, whether the combined working day in a given case acquired this increase in productivity because it heightens the mechanical force of labor, or extends its sphere of action over a greater space, or contracts the field of production relatively to the scale of production, or at the critical moment sets a larger mass of labor to work, or excites rivalry between the individuals and raises their animal spirits, or impresses on the similar operations carried on by a number of people the stamp of continuity and many-sidedness, or performs different operations simultaneously, or economizes the means of production by use in common, or lends to the individual labor the character of average social labor. So these are all these different methods of kind of increasing the social power. He goes, whichever of these is the cause of the increase, the special productive power of the combined working day is under all circumstances the social productive power of labor, or the productive power of social labor. So again, a kind of socialization of the labor process. The power arises from cooperation itself. When the worker cooperates in a planned way with the others, they strip off the fetters of individuality and develop the capabilities of their species, which Marx in his earlier works talks a lot about, like, species being and like what means to be a human. And I think what he's saying here is like, and I think he goes on in this chapter to say that, like, Plato or someone says that humans are a political animal, but they're also a social animal. And insofar as they're social, they're gonna like harness the capability of their socialness by cooperating more as a collective kind of a collective division of labor, like or cooperative labor, which is very different from kind of like the kind of like rugged individualism we often think about in American history, where like individuals were supposed to like get their own land and like in the frontier, like produce their own family subsistence as isolated individuals. And then of course they moved on to become like suburbanites who are supposed to be like isolated nuclear families reproducing themselves as individuals. No, he's saying that, you know, labor and humans, we're social, and we should harness our social power in production, like as a collective, not as isolated, like even isolated artisans or isolated farmers. Like, this is not what being human is really all about. But again, one reading I have of this part 4 is Marx is trying, and there's more quotes to come, but he's trying to argue that capitalism, by developing relative surplus value, is socializing the production process and thereby creating the kind of conditions through which we as a society might appropriate that social process for ourselves, right? Appropriate the gains from it, like, and ultimately raising labor productivity does create the possibility that we could create a society with more free time and stuff like that. Okay. And so, you know, as the capitalist starts to harness this collective power of the workers, obviously there's this sort of antagonistic relationship that comes up, and the workers will suddenly realize like this capitalist is overseeing them and they will resist, right? So he starts to bring back like this process inherently is going to have this kind of class struggle and this antagonism. And ultimately, he brings up the fact that under capitalism, this cooperation is harnessed by the capitalist, and therefore it's this very, what he calls a purely despotic kind of social relation, where the capitalist is like a despot that's overseen. I think he used an example, like an analogy of a conductor of a orchestra. Like they're this despot that kind of is directing the activity of the workers in a purely sort of dictatorial fashion. And so this brings up like one of the key social aspects of capitalism, which is that we organize workplaces, whether it's these old manufacturing workshops or the office space office. We organize these like dictatorships, right? Where the capitalist just controls the whole system from the top down. And so there's this incredible book that came out now about 6 years ago, where it just brings up the fact how employers rule our lives, why we don't talk about it. Americans think they live in democracy, but the workplaces are small tyrannies, right? And this is a great article if you're ever in a position to assign something to undergrads. I think you guys read it in 273, which just sort of lays out how dictatorial our workplaces are and how it's just sort of insane that we accept this in the so-called freedom world, a society of freedom and democracy, where she says, consider some facts about how American employers control their workers. Amazon prohibits employees from exchanging casual remarks while on duty, calling this time theft. Apple inspects the personal belongings of retail workers, some of whom lose up to half an hour of unpaid time every time as they wait in line to be searched. Tyson, this is the worst, prevents its poultry workers from using the bathroom. Some have been forced to urinate on themselves while their supervisors mock them. The other thing that's come out of this is that a lot of them wear diapers to work because they aren't allowed to go to the bathroom. So like fundamental human dignity, like out the window, complete tyrannical despotism, forcing the workers to just work and under this hyper mechanized, efficient type of division of labor, right? So this is, and there's just horrific other examples that come after that. But this is, again, kind of this interesting thing about capitalism where we kind of act like we live in a democracy, but democracy is only like quarantined in this kind of political realm of like the state and government, and we vote and things like this. But there's this whole other realm of society called the economy, and particularly the workplace, where we just accept that it's completely undemocratic and it's completely run like a small despotism, right? So, and he starts to get into how the way in which the capitalist directs this leads to a kind of larger kind of politics of capital, which really like confuses us about who's really behind this socially productive power of the collective worker. The socially productive power of labor develops as a free gift to capital. So again, capital is paying them as individuals, and they are more productive as a whole. And that extra productivity just is something capital can appropriate from these atomized individual wage workers. Whenever the workers are placed under certain conditions, and it is capital which places them under these conditions, because this power costs capital nothing, while on the one hand, it is not developed by the worker until their labor itself belongs to capital, it appears as a power which capital possesses by its nature, a productive power inherent in capital. So here he's saying that we live in a society in which the productivity gains are really coming from the workers themselves and how they're arranged in more productive capacities. But we kind of act like all the productivity gains are done by the capitalist, right? These titans of industry like Elon Musk, who's like a genius, who's come up with all these new efficient ways to produce cars or produce space rockets or whatever it is. And this sort of like way in which we celebrate the capitalist as that's what's really driving progress, that's what's really driving innovation, and it kind of erases the role of all of these workers who are actually doing the grunt work and increasing the productive power of social labor behind the scenes. All right, finally, chapter 14. division of labor and manufacture. So you know that he's kind of talking about the age of manufacture for the most part in this chapter. So he talks about the dual origin of manufacture. He has kind of 2 points. First, you assemble together in one workshop under the control of a single capitalist, workers belonging to various independent handicrafts, through whose hands a given article must pass on its way to completion. So again, it's kind of like on the basis of the handicrafts, you kind of bring all the handicrafts out of their cottages, out of their homes, into one workshop where they can collaborate with one another. And you think about it, like obviously this increases the efficiency of production because you're not, like instead of moving things from cottage to cottage over a scattered countryside, you kind of bring it all into one place, and it moves the time lost from sort of task to task is just highly reduced, right? And so you gain labor productivity, you gain through this kind of place-based cooperation that can happen in this workshop. The other kind of origin, he says, number 2, manufacture can also arise in the opposite way. One capitalist simultaneously employs a workshop of a number of craftspeople who all do the same work or the same kind of work, such as making paper, type, or needles. It's cooperation in its simplest form. So Marx tries to argue that even if you bring a bunch of people into one place that are doing the same thing, you will still see gains in labor productivity because they'll like, again, those animal spirits, they'll like compete with one another, try to go faster. They'll share knowledge of the best way to do things. And like, again, this sort of social power of labor will just create gains, even if they're not like explicitly cooperating like in the production of the commodity. So they could all just be hammering away at the same thing, and they will still produce better than they would as isolated produced like artisans, like in their own little home, isolated from the rest of the world, right? So, okay, so then this is sort of, again, I think a key phrase or sentence where, again, contrast this to chapter 15 next week. Whatever may have been the particular starting point, the final form is always the same. And this is where he's talking about manufacture, the stage of production, manufacture, a productive mechanism whose organs are human beings. And so that's the kind of key, Ellie, is that the productive power of this process is ultimately going to be human muscles and human beings and humans themselves. And next chapter is when we start the productive mechanism, its organs are now something different, a machine, a sort of automatic thing that's running on itself without humans driving it with essentially, if you people are interested in like the transition to like fossil fuel and like a different energy regime, that's what we're talking about in the next chapter, which is like we're going away from muscle powered production to fossil fuel powered automatic machine production, which you could argue has gotten us into this mess. And so a lot to think about there. Okay, so several sections here. Let's just get through them. The specialized worker and their tools. I think he kind of sums this up in the opening opening paragraph of this section. It is firstly clear that a worker who performs the same simple operation for the whole of their life converts their body into an automatic one-sided implement of that operation. Consequently, they take less time in doing it than the craftsperson who performs a whole series of operations in succession. The collective worker, and again, I love this language of like, we're talking about a collective social worker who constitutes the living mechanism of manufacture, is made up solely of such one-sided specialized workers. Hence, in comparison with the independent handicraft, more is produced in less time. That's what this whole section, part 4, is about. In other words, the productivity of labor is increased. Moreover, once this partial labor is established as the exclusive function of one person, the methods employed become perfected. The workers' continued repetition of the same narrowly defined act and the concentration of their attention on it teach by experience how to attain the desired effect with the minimum of exertion. But since there are always several generations of workers living at one time and working together at the manufacture of a given article, the technical skill, the tricks of the trade thus acquired become established and are accumulated and handed down. So here he's really just talking about how the labor process becomes just more specialized and more subdivided, and more workers get sort of divided into doing just one monotonous, boring task. And we'll get into how that affects the workers. But ultimately, since they're just doing one task, they get really good at it, and it becomes just hyper efficient because of this subdivision. And the more specialization, and again, through specialization, the worker might just have one tool that they need to master how to learn how to use, right? And they figure that out. Moving right along. So he talks about the two fundamental forms of manufacture, heterogeneous and organic. Heterogeneous, he uses the example of a watch, where it seems he's saying is that each of the components of the watch really need a specialized kind of worker and handicraft person to figure out how to make, like the cap jewel, the wheels, whatever all these things are. And he lists them, right? He lists all the different things that go into a watch. He's saying that like each of these little tiny things actually needs to be produced by a different person. And he actually even says like, you don't even save that much by bringing them all into one workshop. Like you can just subcontract it out to many different producers, and then the final assembly is not that big a deal, right? And so that's kind of the heterogeneous, where you have all these different handicrafts that are really specialized of the different components. Bringing them together is not really the fundamental part of the labor process. Organic is more, this is some picture I found of glass production, which he uses as an example, where it's really like you need workers to pass one thing to another, and they're constantly adding to the process of production. And it's this kind of delicate dance, if you will. Much of his description of this division of labor is almost like a ballet, like a coordination where each worker is sort of passing some part of the product to the next, and they're adding to it, and they're kind of in this collective organism of collective workers doing these things in common. And that is what he calls organic, where you do have this kind of really delicate dance of interconnected processes in the workshop itself. He I'll get into that in a second, but I find this interesting where he basically says that like as the work process gets more subdivided, it becomes a little bit prone to costly problems when any little part of the labor process becomes interrupted or becomes shut down, right? So he says that and when we get to large scale industry, this requirement emerges as a characteristic and costly limitation, and one that's inherent in the principle of manufacture. So what he's trying to hint at there is one reason capitalists decide to kind of implement machinery is because they were sick of relying on all these intricate workers that were each little task had to be done by a human worker. And that makes the capitalist vulnerable to what happens if one of those workers stops producing their little specialized task. Or what happens when the workers go on strike and shut down particularly important parts of the supply chain, right? And so this is about the UAW strike. And it's straight out of chapter 13 and 14, the interconnected nature of automobile manufacturing, where parts arrive just in time to be used in production, makes it difficult for car makers to plan when they do not know which plant or distribution center will be targeted by a strike next. And they said they don't know which plant to keep shipping parts to and which plants to stop shipping parts to, said Eric Gordon, a professor of business school. It makes supply chain planning more difficult. So this is when you have a interconnected, subdivided labor process that ultimately relies on these human workers doing their little part of the task, it makes the whole system vulnerable to choke points, to supply chain shutdowns and strikes, where they can just shut down part of the supply chain, and they can And as I think the UAW is, they're thinking, the headline, surgical strikes. They're thinking strategically about what parts of the supply chain are really vulnerable to this interconnected division of labor, and how can we kind of shut down things that can really force the employer to kind of come to the table with some, hopefully they'll come to the table with some more gains in the contract negotiations. But that's the strategy, at least. And again, this is although Marx kind of, you might think he's saying like, well, then large scale industry comes and they just destroy the vulnerability of capital to the division of labor. But it's still there, right? The capital's still reliant on this interconnected network of workers, right? Yeah.
I have like kind of a bizarre example of this. It's like another animal hospital thing, but there's like a certain surgery that like large dogs as puppies need to get for like the sake of like their orthopedic health. And there's these special x-rays that are taken called pen hip x-rays, and there's like one doctor at like University of Pennsylvania who interprets these x-rays, and it's like a very time sensitive thing, like I think 15 to 17 weeks. And there was one time during the summer where someone was like, yeah, the doctor's on vacation, so all these x-rays that have been sent haven't been interpreted yet. So like it's like it is a medical thing, but it's also like a financial thing, because like they're like, oh, these really expensive surgeries can't happen because this one person
Right
who interprets these x-rays or is out of the office.
And you can see how, like, if there's a particular worker with a particular set of skills, the whole thing sort of is they can shut it down or they can keep it going, right? So that's a lot of power for that particular medical professional, right?
Yeah.
So that's just a little side note I found interesting. The next thing is this is really like the ballet of production. I just found this passage on 464. If we look at this workshop as a complete mechanism, we see the raw material in all stages of production at the same time. The collective worker, formed from the combination, draws the wire with one set of tooled up hands, straightens the wire with another set, armed with different tools, cuts it with another set, point it with another set, and so on. The different stages of the process, previously successive in time, become simultaneously and contiguous in space. Hence a greater quantity of finished commodities produced within the same period. So he's talking about this kind of dance of one stage to another, workers passing things and collectively doing this all as one kind of single mechanism. Beautiful stuff. Another fascinating thing about this increasing subdivision of the labor process is since the various functions performed by the collective worker can be simple or complex, high or low, the individual labor powers, their organs require different degrees of training and must therefore possess different values. So he actually, remember, he kind of said, we're just going to assume everything's simple labor. We're going to abstract from the complex differences in skills. He kind of brings it back in here. And he talks about how alongside the gradations of hierarchy, there appears simple separation of workers into skilled and unskilled. For the latter, the cost of the apprenticeship vanishes. For the former, it diminishes compared with the required of the craftsman, owing to the simplification of the functions. In both cases, the value of labor power falls. As you subdivide labor more and more, you make it more a menial task and you de-skill it, right? And you can therefore say you can widen, whatever I'm trying to say, the types of jobs and tasks that are seen as unskilled and easily replaceable, easily disposable. And the skilled parts of the trade are, which again, as your example from the animal hospital shows, like if more of your labor process is dependent on skills, then you're vulnerable as a capitalist. So ultimately, de-skilling not only makes you less vulnerable, but it also reduces the value of labor power, right? You can pay those workers less, they're easily replaceable, et cetera, et cetera. So here we start to get into this kind of the hierarchy of the working class, the different skill levels, the ways in which ultimately capital aims to kind of de-skill the working class as a whole. And they get much more powerful at this with the advent of machinery and large scale industry. Another fascinating section, the division of labor and manufacture, and division of labor and society. So here they talk about how do we think about how capital subdivides labor in their own enterprise, in their own factory, in their own manufacturing establishment. How does that relate to the wider division of labor in all of society, as society as a whole is increasingly sort of subdivided into different production of food and energy and housing, and all interconnects. If you recall, we talked a lot about the division of labor in society when we talked about commodities and kind of how society sort of becomes subject to these price fluctuations and market gyrations that kind of allocate labor in this kind of chaotic way. So this is an interesting distinction. One of those frustrating things for Marx is he can bring up something really important and then just leave it aside, right? So the foundation of every division of labor, which has attained a certain degree of development and has been brought about by the exchange of commodities, is the separation of town and country, or the separation between cities and rural areas. As a geographer, this is like super interesting, right? We're talking about how like cities ultimately rely on sort of this hinterland of rural production to kind of provision the cities in this interconnected relationship. One might well say that the whole economic history of society is summed up in the movement of this antithesis. However, for the moment, we shall not go into this. Sucks. Why not? Anyway. Ultimately, he does something really interesting here, where he says, okay, we're talking about the division of labor in manufacture versus society. But what is it that forms the bond between the independent laborers of the cattle breeder, the tanner, and the shoemaker? Imagining that each of those are private capitalists selling those products separately. It is the fact that their respective products are commodities, right? What, on the other hand, characterizes the division of labor and manufacture? The fact that the specialized worker produced no commodities. So if you take that wire in the workshop and add value to it and pass it to your coworker, you're not selling that as a commodity to your coworker. You're producing a use value for your coworker to add value to. So there's not a market, or there's not an internal process of commodity selling in the capitalist enterprise, in the factory, in the zone of manufacture. So he goes further. This is the next page, I think. This keeps going down. Yep. The planned and regulated a priori system on which the division of labor is implemented in the workshop becomes, in the division of labor within society, an a posteriori necessity imposed by nature, controlling the unregulated caprice of the producers and perceptible in the fluctuations and barometer of market prices. So he sums this up very well. What we have is, in the capitalist mode of production, in a society where it prevails, you get anarchy in the division of labor of society, where it's the division of labor in society is guided by just markets and commodity exchanges and the gyrations of markets and the anarchy of markets. But it's despotism in the workshop, in the actual zone of production. That part of society is submitted to social regulation and planning, right? The capitalist actually plans in the workshop. They actually regulate what goes in, what goes out, how to subdivide the task, how to organize production in a planned way. But when we look at society where we want to, like, say, get off fossil fuels and solve climate change, we act like we can't plan, right? We just have to let the market figure it out in this very anarchic or chaotic way. So there's a really good book about this that's called The People's Republic of Walmart, which shows that if you think that capitalism is all about markets and not planning, you should go into the corporation we call Walmart, because it's a massive socializing planning mechanism. Walmart plans, they use barcodes to measure each and every store, what people buy, when they buy it, and they plan production from China to sort of precisely be the amount of commodities they need to churn into these stores. It's called just-in-time production. Amazon too is always kind of planning internal to the firm, right? There's all this planning, and so they compare like basically like the Soviet Union tried to do planning for a whole country, for society, right? They tried to implement planning and they failed. But what they argue in this book is that maybe one reason they failed is they didn't have the information technology and computers that Walmart now has and that many corporations now have to do kind of large scale planning internal to these corporations. And therefore, perhaps these corporations are kind of creating the social conditions for us to expropriate their technologies to do planning on the scale of society, right? Because Walmart and Amazon are cool at planning inside the firm, but as a society, we don't get to plan, right? We just let the market figure everything out in this anarchic way. Okay, almost done, sorry. Finally, he gets into what he calls the capitalist character of manufacturer. And this is how he starts to say that this system really, it kind of really messes up the worker. When improving labor productivity through increasing divisions of labor and increasing subdivisions, it actually converts the worker into a crippled monstrosity. By furthering their particular skill into a forcing house through the suppression of the whole world of productive drives and inclinations, just as the states of Lapada, they butcher a whole beast for the sake of his hide or his tallow. Not only is the specialized work distributed among different individuals, but the individual themselves is divided up and transformed into an automatic motor of detail operation. So he's saying that under this system, with the workers just doing one monotonous thing over and over again, it just becomes the soul crushing. Right? And those of us that have worked in like bureaucracies and like in these kind of like highly subdivided systems, which again, that movie Office Space, it's really, that's what it's all about. Like you see how workers get sort of turned into these kind of one-sided crippled monstrosities. And he actually draws from Adam Smith and other people that admitted like this beautiful thing, the division of labor that increases the wealth of nations, also like makes the workers really ignorant and kind of stultified, right? Ignorance is the mother of industry, as well as superstition. Reflection and fancy are subject to error, but a habit of moving the hand or the foot is independent of neither. Manufacturers, according, prosper most when the mind is least consulted, and where the workshop may be considered an engine, the parts which are men. So he introduces this phrase like the laborer becomes an appendage to the workshop. But eventually in chapter 15, he talks about the worker as an appendage to a machine. But here they're just an appendage to this larger process. They don't feel like they have much agency in, right? Because it's capitalist designs the labor process, the division of labor, and the worker just is subjugated by this sort of despotic form. And so there's all this kind of language, some of which I think is from M. Smith. Like all other divisions of labor, that between hand and head labor is more pronounced and decided in proportion as society becomes richer. So this is also a process of, again, dividing this division, or just creating a stark division between mental labor and manual labor, and trying to de-skill. And nowadays we would talk about de-skilling all of it, but back then they would kind of say like try to really de-skill the manual labor to make it just so simple that anyone could do it. And the mental labors are kind of up in the factory kind of office, kind of crunching numbers and trying to figure out the most efficient way to organize the workers in this way. Some crippling of body and mind is inseparable even from the division of labor in society as a whole. However, since manufacture carries out the social separation of branches of labor much further, and also by its peculiar division, attacks the individual at very roots of his life, it's the first system to provide the materials and impetus for industrial pathology. And in the footnote, they're like, this is the first era where the people started to like try to understand like, why are the workers getting so sick and depressed in these workplaces? To subdivide a human is to execute them. So quite stark. this here is, okay, so, but here he's saying that actually capital is developing something that might be harnessed for better ends. As specifically capitalist form of the process of social production, and on the foundations available to it, it could not develop any other form than the capitalist one. The division of labor and manufacture is merely a particular method of creating relative surplus value or augmenting the self-valorization of capital, usually described as social wealth, wealth of nations, etc. He's sort of making fun of Smith there, at the expense of the workers. So they develop all this great labor productivity, but it does so at the expense of the worker. Not only does it increase the socially productive power of labor for the benefit of the capitalist instead of the worker, it also does this by crippling the individual worker. It produces new conditions for the domination of capital over labor. If, therefore, on the one hand, it appears historically as an advance and necessary aspect of the economic process of the formation of society, on the other hand, it appears more refined and civilized means of exploitation. So he kind of has this kind of dialectic of this process is sort of a necessary march of progress, if you will, of making labor more cooperative, more social, more productive, and any sort of, I think he would argue, any kind of communist society would have to have like high levels of labor productivity at its core, but it's doing so in a way that's just ultimately quite dehumanizing and quite destructive to the workers themselves. But since handicraft skill is the foundation of manufacture, which means this system of manufacture ultimately is rooted in the hands and the muscles and the movements of human workers, since the mechanism of manufacture as a whole possesses no objective framework which would be independent of the workers, capital is constantly compelled to wrestle with the insubordination of the workers. So they're vulnerable to these workers. The workers are going to resist, and they keep having to deal with these pesky workers, right? And he says, hence the complaint that the workers lack discipline runs through the whole period of manufacture. So the capitalists are constantly complaining these damn workers that we rely on just are so lazy. They're not disciplined. They don't show up. They don't do what I tell them, blah, blah, blah. And they're just always having to struggle with these pesky workers. So that's why we start to say, like, what if we could replace these workers with some other productive mechanism that would follow orders, right? And that's where you get the idea of what's the Mike Judge? He did Office Space, but his follow-up movie was more from the perspective of the capitalist. Jason Bateman, I forget the name of it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Anyway, look it up. But in that movie, they're looking at all the workers on the floor, and the boss is just sitting there and like, can we figure out a way to replace these all with machines? Because they were like all like talking and not being productive and it's kind of whatever. But so this obviously the last page sets up where we're going next, which is the barriers placed in the way of the domination of capital are going to fall. Like these barriers of the human hands that drive the product, those barriers will be crushed by the introduction of machinery and so forth. Okay.